Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Welcome to Self-Host 101 Office Hours Live. So we are currently live on Twitch and YouTube and also TikTok. So if you're watching live, say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from. This is the first live stream I'm doing here on the Syntax channel, so I'm super excited. And the plan for today is... I have to juggle a bunch of things, so that's why I'm looking over this way. But the plan for today is to cover all of the questions and comments that showed up in the last Office Hours video. So there are quite a few good questions. I've got some resources for you, and I'll show you some demos as well once we get into it. We are answering questions and comments from all of these fine people as well. So if you're in this list and you're watching live, let us know. But yeah, I'm going to check in the chat, make sure everything's good, make sure people are here. Can you hear me okay? Let me know. Yeah, and the intro music is awesome. Scott made that, so definitely check out that link. Am I loud and clear? Nice. There's probably like a little bit of delay. Once I know that you all can hear me, you can see me. We have like two scenes to work with. Sounds great? Okay. We've got overview scene. And we've got this scene here that has the screen and my face here. Loud and clear? Awesome. So yeah, but welcome in everyone. Wannes Salom is tuning in from the Netherlands. That's great. We're actually answering two of their questions today. Halako can hear me. Welcome in. Welcome Grafexi and Dimitrios. And Stony, welcome to the Syntax side. Stony has been watching Coding Garden, my other channel, for a very long time. And Twitch Ve Turkey, welcome in. And Be Mind, also a Coding Garden fan. Welcome in everyone. And Paolo's here. What's up, Paolo? It's good to see all your faces in the chat. And Wawa Gangster watching over on TikTok. Good to see you. Let's get into it. So the way this is going to work is I have a bunch of stuff prepared. So I'm going to go through these questions and comments. For each one, I'm going to do my best to answer it, also show you some resources. And then when I'm done, I'll pop back over to the comments and see if you have any extra questions beyond what I covered. So that's the plan. So for while I'm answering the questions, I'm not going to see the chat. I'm just going to be doing my best to answer these questions, but I will go back to the chat. But let's jump right in. So the first question comes from Alexander Rossi, and the question is: thanks for the tutorial, but I followed every step, got Namecheap domain, and then did Cloudflare DNS setup, and I can't get access to the server via the domain. Is there an extra step missing? So, if you are unfamiliar with the questions we're answering, they're coming from this video. So this is a video I posted last week about setting up Caddy on your own VPS. And so all the questions I'm answering are from this video. And this first question, I do believe that Alexander actually figured it out. They mentioned in the comments that they got it working. But the issue was they didn't have all the right ports open. And this is probably my fault. I think I hinted at the fact that you need both port 80 for HTTP and port 443 for HTTPS to be open, but I kind of glossed over the fact that you need port 443 to be open. And that was their main issue. They had everything working with their domain, DNS was working, but whenever they set up HTTPS with Caddy, the site wouldn't load. And that's because HTTPS runs over port 443. That's the default port. And you may not realize this, but when you go to a website and it's HTTPS, your browser is actually typing in, well, not typing in, but it's sending across that port by default 443. So if I try to connect to the site and actually put in 443, you'll see the browser just removes it because that's the default port for HTTPS. And same thing for HTTP. Wikipedia has an HTTP redirect, but if you try to go to the site and then specify the port as port 80, that will redirect and you actually don't see the port. So by default, all this web browsing that we're doing is happening on port 80. It's happening on port 443. So any web server that you set up, you're absolutely going to need port 80 and port 443 open. And then beyond that, you probably might also want to have your SSH port open, which is typically port 22. If you give me just a second, I need to change a browser setting, but I will be right back. Oh, hey. I forgot that I had this scene on, you can't see it on TikTok, but if you're watching on Twitch or YouTube, you can see my whole studio. I forgot that I had this be right back scene. Cool. All right, we're back. Cool. So yeah, thank you very much, Alexander, for your question. Ultimately, ports are very important. So if you're serving HTTP traffic, you need port 80. If you're serving HTTPS, you need port 443 open. So any questions or comments so far on what we talked about? Let's see. And Liam, good to see you. Welcome in. Can we do a live Q&A voice chat? I don't have that set up, but that would actually be very fun to do in the future. And especially if we can get some like Discord engagement, it would be fun to get some like a voice channel in the Discord, and then I could, you all could phone in and ask questions. That would be fun. But I have so much I'm juggling on my streaming computer. I don't think we can do it today. Yeah, and so Paolo says, I spent a bunch of time dealing with my VPS with Coolify and Cloudflare, was getting a bunch of misses. In the end, I was always connecting to a different data center. Oh no, oh no. Is it a bad idea to have your database in a VPS? We were actually going to talk about this later. So there's a question that popped up about being able to host databases on your VPS. I wouldn't say it's a bad idea, but there's a lot you need to take into account. Things like backups, replication. It's not that easy. I mean, technically, if your site isn't that big and you don't have a lot of users, you could host a database, but there's a lot you need to think about. So we'll cover that in a little bit. Yeah, and definitely check out the Discord, because lots of fun people over there. Stu James says, would you advise hosting a UI server and DB in the same VPS for an app that pays? It's all going to depend on the amount of users that you have, the amount of traffic that your site has, and also the size of the VPS that you're hosting it on. Because it is possible, but part of a more scalable architecture is you separate those things. Like you potentially host your static UI on a CDN, so it can load really fast and be replicated across the world. You potentially have multiple servers behind a load balancer. You have like a replica set of your DB. So like there's ways to scale this stuff that you potentially need to think about depending on the size of your app and how many users you have. But I will say in my professional career, I have hosted the database. Well, actually, no. Most of what I've done in my career, the database is almost always on something like AWS RDS, because they handle the backups, they handle all of the stuff for the important data. So we're willing to pay that price for AWS RDS. But for like UI server and API server, I've run those on a single VPS for an app that has maybe a few hundred users. So it really depends on your use case. Twitch v Turkey says, should one use Caddy reverse proxy when developing or just use ports? It's completely up to you. I know a lot of people use Caddy in development. So that way it makes it easier to do like HTTPS and stuff like that. But yeah, and Jake says, I've been dabbling with running LLMs locally. You think it would be cheaper to host an LLM on a VPS or use the OpenAI API? We're getting off track, but it's fine because I enjoy answering your questions. LLMs typically require a GPU, and it can get very expensive. So if you look into VPSs that have a GPU attached to them, they are much more expensive than like a $5 VPS. A lot of times it starts at like a minimum $100 a month. So more often than not, just using the OpenAI API or the Gemini API or any of these other AI APIs are probably going to be more cost effective than trying to run stuff on a server that needs a GPU. Yeah. And can you set up CI/CD with a VPS? We're going to answer that question today, so that is coming up. Let's see, do I have any other questions from TikTok or Twitch? Yeah. Stony and BMine, they're definitely the Twitch dudes. But yeah, so BMine says, I use Cap Rover and I love hosting a DB that is only exposed to the other containers. That's the thing to consider, right? So we talked about security in the first video in the self-host series. So if you don't know what we're talking about, go to youtube.com/syntaxfm and go to playlists. There is specifically this playlist called Self-Host 101. And so the very first video, I show you how to lock down a VPS. And one of the parts of locking it down is to lock down your firewall. So you only have the ports open that you actually need. What that means is if you have other services running on the server, like a database, you don't have to expose that to the world, especially if that API that is accessing that database is running on the server itself. So you can have the database running right next to the API and you don't need to expose it to the world. There are implications of that because you have to make sure you have backups for your database and everything else. But yeah. How do you store secrets on a VPS? We'll save this one for later. Remind me if once I finish answering questions, we'll come back to this because there are some open source projects they're basically like vaults where you can keep your various keys that you want to share between services. But typically these are just stored in environment variables on the server itself. Yeah, Caprover versus Doku versus Coolify. I am trying Coolify right now. In the future, it would be fun for me to try the others so I can compare and contrast them. But so far, Coolify is one of the first like platform as a service things that I've self-hosted platform as a service tools that I've tried. I've done most of this stuff by hand, which is kind of what I'm showing in this series. Cool. Thank you for your questions. Let's keep moving. These next questions and comments come from Caribbean. The first one is, wow, what a great video, full of content. Quick question, when setting up the DNS records for various websites, why not use CNAMES with the @target? And Ecognito similarly says, curious if there is a reason you don't use CNAME instead of A records for the www entries in your DNS. Great question. Let's talk about it and let's show what they mean. So if you watch that video, I set up several DNS records. And these are all A records pointing directly to these IP addresses. But we actually talked about CNAME records, which are pointing to a domain instead of an IP address. And because all of these are exactly the same, one of the things that you could do is you could, for instance, set the A record on the root domain, right? So set it for notlocalhost.net. And then for every other domain that you add, create a CNAME record that points to notlocalhost.net, very similar to how I have this banana record that points to notlocalhost.net. And the benefit of that is now you only have a single spot you need to update if you ever change servers or like your IP address changes or something like that. So this is definitely a valid way of going about it. The one thing to think about though is whenever DNS lookups are happening, that's one more hop that needs to happen for these other domains, because once a DNS record resolves to a domain like this, then we have to query for that domain to find its IP address. So for instance, let's pull up the terminal and let's just do a dig on banana.notlocalhost.net. So if we do a dig banana.notlocalhost.net and we say we want all the CNAME records, you're going to see it returns this. So any client that is querying for DNS is going to get this result back, and it has to do a further query to now get the IP address. So now that client would need to do notlocalhost.net A record finally to get the IP address of the server. So you are adding one more bit of indirection, but it's a completely valid thing to do. And then same thing goes for these www records, right? So in the tutorial, we set up a redirect. So if you have a website hosted at a subdomain like this, when someone goes to www.that subdomain, you want to redirect it back to the server. And in this scenario, it would make a lot of sense to put the domain of the root server there. So that way, because those two things are definitely linked together, you only update them in one spot, right? So, and let's just do it. So for www.bigtimer, we could actually point it to bigtimer and not the IP address. Let's update it. So if I change this to a CNAME record and I point it to bigtimer.notlocalhost.net, load TTL and save it. Now, when someone goes to www.bigtimer, it's going to resolve to this, then they'll look up the IP address and it will be this. And so because these two records are like very closely linked together, they're always going to be hosted on the same app. That's another scenario where you would, you could link them with a CNAME like that. So ultimately for the tutorial, I wanted everything to be very clear that we're pointing domains at IP addresses, which is why I didn't do the CNAME stuff. But in practice, it makes sense, especially if you have a lot of domains to manage. I will say one of the things I didn't show in the video, but I am going to be showing in the Coolify video, is what's called a wildcard record. So let's say you are spinning up a bunch of apps and you want to be able to dynamically load any subdomain, so anything.notlocalhost.net, you can add what's called a wildcard domain. So if you do a star right here, this means anything.notlocalhost.net that doesn't appear in this list, right? If it's something that doesn't have its own specific entry, will resolve to whatever you specify right there. And that allows you to have like dynamic subdomains, especially using something like Coolify, where you want like a Vercel-like experience where every app has a unique subdomain. So wildcards are something I'm going to talk about in the next video. So thank you to both Caribbean and Ecognito for those questions. I'm going to jump back into the chat, see if we have any other things that are popping up. IP address, yeah. I was looking at Bitbucket to store secrets on a VPS. I haven't done that specifically. I wonder if they have a product offering for that. Yeah, so Twitch v Turkey says, where did you put the secret coupon in the video? So if you missed it, in the video, at the very end of the video, specifically this last one here about Caddy. I mentioned somewhere there is a place where you can find a way to get a free t-shirt, and it was actually just in a text record. So that text record is still there, but it doesn't have the link to the form anymore. But if you just did a dig on notlocalhost.net and searched for text records, you would have seen this text record, and it had a link to a Google form. So the first person to do that was Eli, and they got their free t-shirt. And then in the previous video, so in the very first video, I made it so that anybody that went to the IP address of the server literally hosted on the website, so not localhost.net. It just had a link right here to a form, and Matt Kilcup was the one that found that. So every video will have something slightly hidden in it that could potentially get you a free t-shirt. So yeah, welcome in, Randy. Good to see you. Good to see you, and welcome in everyone over here watching on TikTok as well. Hello, hello. All right, let's get back into it. Actually, we have a comment from Stony Eagle. So Cloudflare with a reverse proxy in a Docker container is amazing for collaborating with the streamer and having live reloading without leaking my IP and having SSL. I believe we're about to talk about the Cloudflare reverse proxy, but I could believe it, yeah, because Cloudflare can potentially hide the IP address of the server that you're working on. Yeah. Demetrios is asking, can SQLite scale, and how does replication work across regions? I think of it like simple files, but nowadays it got complicated. Yeah, personally, I don't have a lot of experience with it, but my understanding of it in terms of using SQLite at the edge. So there's this idea of using a SQLite database on edge functions, and I believe that just is replication. So every single edge function literally gets a SQLite flat file, and its changes are written to it, and then those changes are replicated across every other edge instance that has a SQLite flat file on it. That's my understanding. I'd have to dig deeper into it, but that's essentially how they do it, because SQLite is a flat file database. It's literally just that. So yeah. Roel is asking, should you host your own mail server? Probably not. That's actually one of the last questions we're going to answer today. I have some resources for you, but hosting a mail server is not easy because of spam and also this idea of IP address reputation. So we'll talk about that. Halako is saying, in our team, we use a Laravel API and we use cookies for auth, but it needs to be on the same domain to work. Yeah, these days it's really hard to do cross-site cookies. So yeah. Is there a way to tunnel out all local hosts and add the same domain? Yes, that's a reverse proxy. And actually, if we look, we're all over the place today, but that's okay. I feel like it's more fun to answer the questions as they come up than just stick to a specific script. But if you look at reverse proxy in the Caddy directives, they actually have an example of this where you can essentially have a combined website where the root of the website is served via a static file server, but then specifically just for the /API route, that is served via a reverse proxy. So as long as your API is being served at a unique URL that doesn't interfere with your client-side files, you can set up a reverse proxy this way. It's pretty much just this. So you have your top-level Caddy file, and above this, you would have a file server directive and then point to the folder that you want to serve the files from. And so most of the website, it's going to be served from those static files. But if someone hits /API, or in this case, /prefix, that's going to be reverse proxied to wherever your API server is running. So that's an extremely common way of doing things where it's all served from the same domain, but technically the API is hosted somewhere else, or it's running on a separate port, but it all is hit under the same domain. Cool. Good questions, everyone. Good questions. All right, let's get back into it. Next up, Vincent Pena says, this is what I need. Please, for the next video, could you do a guide for securing your server from DDoS, or Distributed Denial of Service? Thanks, CJ. Oh, you're welcome. Kirabishian also says, why not use the Cloudflare proxy to mask the VPS IP? Isn't that a common practice? It is, and we'll talk about that. So, and also JitX says, I think by disabling the cloud on Cloudflare, we're missing a lot of Cloudflare features like caching and security, and we can hide our external IP address behind the Cloudflare proxy. Let me show you what they are talking about. So, on Cloudflare, if you saw in the last video, I was setting these records, but whenever you set a record on Cloudflare, they have this option for a proxy. Now, the reason I didn't show this in the video is because I wanted the tutorial to be relevant for people that weren't specifically just using Cloudflare, because all of the stuff I talked about for DNS is general. Like anywhere you manage your DNS, you can use what I talked about to do that there. The Cloudflare proxy is specific to Cloudflare. There are other services that offer it, but not every DNS provider offers it. And essentially what it does is it proxies all traffic through Cloudflare, so that way there's multiple benefits. One of them is you can hide the IP address of the server. So let's actually enable this here and see it in action. So right now, when we do a dig for notlocalhost.net, and we're looking for A records, this is revealing the real IP address of the server, right? So this is the actual IP address of the VPS that I set up. If we enable the Cloudflare proxy, let's do it. We check the button, we click save. It's going to take a second for this record to expire, remember, because I set a 60-second TTL. But this was pretty instant. So you'll notice now when I query for it, instead of seeing the IP address of my server, I'm seeing the IP address of Cloudflare's proxies. And actually, this is a fun little thing we didn't talk about in the video, but technically you can have multiple A records that point to different IP addresses. And this is one way of doing load balancing, kind of like at the DNS level. So when a client looks up a domain to point it to an IP address, if it gets multiple records, it might try both of them. There might be logic to try the one that's closer to it geographically, but we right now actually have two servers that are sitting in front waiting for requests, and any requests that come into these servers for this domain are then going to be proxied to our main server. And so the first benefit here is we actually don't see our server IP address listed whenever we do a dig. These are actually Cloudflare IP addresses. And so we should still be able to go to the website. Let's try it. Yeah, still resolves, but technically it's routing that traffic through Cloudflare. And Cloudflare has a bunch of other features, including one of the things you can do is distributed denial of service protection, where you can put up a CAPTCHA. So if you go into DNS, actually no, if you go to the overview of your domain, there's this little checkbox right here that says under attack mode. And if you check this, every single visitor to your website will have to either do a CAPTCHA or just like prove that they're a human. And you've probably experienced this before. Like if you've gone to a website and you had to put a CAPTCHA in and you saw like the Cloudflare logo, that's what's happening. And let's enable it. So let's click this. We're under attack. And then it's possible, I tried this earlier, so it's possible it won't work for me, but let's see if I go to the domain. So if I do a hard refresh, so don't load from the cache. Yeah, you can see first we see that Cloudflare page. It knows I'm a human because I'm not doing anything malicious from my IP address. So I don't even have to do the CAPTCHA. It just takes me there. But I want you all to try this. I'm going to throw the link in the chat. Try going there. You should actually see the Cloudflare, unless the page is cached, you should see, autocannon the site. So Ben is mentioning autocannon. So autocannon is a way of automating requests and like load testing a website. So we could do that. We could potentially try to fire requests against it, but because that Cloudflare page is now in front of it, that's going to stop any traffic before it even hits our server, and they have to do the CAPTCHA. Now, there are ways for bots or in whatever else to get around CAPTCHAs, but it is one good level of protection. But let me know in the chat, are you seeing that Cloudflare page? But let's see. They asked for the CAPTCHA. Nice. And so that's one simple way to help with distributed denial of service attacks. So Cloudflare has a huge infrastructure. They have this on the free tier, so you can even use this without paying them a monthly fee. There are other services that do a similar thing. But this is one way of doing it. If all of a sudden your website is getting flooded with a bunch of traffic, you enable this, that's at least going to stop some of the traffic. Beyond that, it really comes down to your actual application code. So you can do things, or potentially like your load balancer code or configuration. You can do things like rate limiting. So based on IP address, you can limit the number of requests that are coming in. And if too many requests come in, you can block those requests. You can also lock things down behind authentication. So that way everything fails unless it actually, the user is logged in and they're a valid user. So there are more things you can do beyond just like this attack mode from Cloudflare, specifically talking about distributed denial of service attacks. But yeah. So let's see. Osa says, or Usa says, I am officially a human. Nice. And B-Mine says, it let me pass. Confirmed, I'm a human. Nice. Glad to hear it. Bindlegen says, can I self-host DDoS protection? There's probably a product out there, but I have not looked into it. But it seems likely. I don't think Cloudflare offers their services to be self-hosted, but ultimately what you would need to do is just set up extra servers, right? So if you had some requirement to set up this DDoS protection, you're essentially setting up load balancers in a way. So you set up servers that are going to proxy requests, but they have the configuration to block multiple requests, or if it's the first time that it's seeing an IP address, it could potentially throw up a static page. The more I think about it, I'm like, yeah, I could build that. But there's probably a self-host option out there somewhere. Nice. Cool. All right, let's keep moving. And Stony says, against script kiddies, you just need a good CPU and a ton of RAM on your router. Nice. Cool. All right, more questions. Let's get back to it. Why not use the Cloudflare proxy to mask the VPS? Isn't that common practice? We just talked about that. So one of the things I will mention, I was testing this out earlier and I ran into a redirection loop. So one thing you want to do specifically if you're using Cloudflare is if you've set up HTTPS redirection with Caddy on your server, you need to enable full TLS encryption mode. Because without it, Cloudflare will make an HTTP request to your server. And if you remember, Caddy is serving up HTTPS redirects. So if we do a curl against our server and show all the headers, so if we do not localhost.net, specifically, we're requesting over HTTP, not HTTPS. Well, actually, I forgot. We set up Cloudflare. So Cloudflare is actually responding with the HTTPS redirect. But let's see if I can easily disable Cloudflare without waiting a while. And I can show you that Caddy header that gets set. But ultimately, if you don't configure this correctly, it creates a redirect loop because Cloudflare requests HTTP from your server. That responds, Caddy responds, and it's like, oh, hey, you should load over HTTPS. And then Cloudflare attempts to make like an HTTP request to an HTTP side. It's just like an infinite loop. So what you need to do is if you enable full encryption like I showed here, that makes it so that Cloudflare makes an HTTPS request by default to your server instead of an HTTP request. But let's see, I just disabled Cloudflare. Yeah, it's going to be cached for a while. And if we try doing another dig record, oh, it should be back. Cloudflare is still there. We're dealing with caching at this point because essentially we set that up and we're going to have to wait for the cache to clear. It looks like the A record's cleared up pretty quickly. But I will just mention this. If you enable that, make sure you check this box here. And if you don't check this box, you would have to disable HTTPS redirect within Caddy, which is possible. But I would recommend just checking that box there. Cool. All right, did I miss anything else here? Yeah, that's the main thing. You can hide your IP address. You can very easily prevent distributed denial of service attacks. So yeah, what else we got? Good call, Stony Eagle. I completely forgot about that. So right now, because I'm dealing with that cached page, we're going to disable I'm under attack, but also there's this option here called development mode, and that will just disable the cache entirely. And so if you're dealing with cached issues on Cloudflare, check this box, and that should prevent loading stuff from the cache. Let's see if that actually worked quickly. It's going to take a second. It's for whatever reason. I mean, it could be that this is actually cached locally to my machine, like geographically. But yeah. All right. Any other comments or questions before we jump into the next question? Yeah, good call. Julian is mentioning, I forgot to turn this off, but like technically I I disabled the proxy altogether. So if you don't have the proxy enabled here, the setting over here shouldn't affect it. But I think I just have to wait at this point. Always set it full. Nice. I missed this. And what's up, Mike the Tree Climber? Have you talked about the difference between A and AAAA names and CNAMEs? I always have a problem wrapping my head around that stuff every time I set up a new site. I did talk about it a little bit. And if you haven't seen the video that I did about Caddy, the first 10 minutes of the video, I talk about DNS and I talk about A records and CNAME records. I don't talk about quadruple A records, and quadruple A records are just A records, but for IPv6. So let me show you. But and I'll run through what they are really quick because it's not too bad. So when you see an A record, think IP address, IP address, IP address. If it's an A record, it is specifically pointing to an IP address of some server. If you see a CNAME address, that needs to point to a domain. So we actually have a CNAME set up for Banana. So when you go to banana.notlocalhost.net, that DNS is going to resolve to this domain. But that means we have to further query for it. So CNAMEs get set to domains, A records get set to IP addresses. It's as simple as that. And then beyond that, AAA records are for IPv6. And so IPv6 is the newer version of Internet Protocol addresses. And they look very similar to MAC addresses. But you really only set these if your server supports IPv6, like if it's connected to a network and it has an IPv6 address. Right now, when this live stream is happening, A records are still kind of the main thing, and IPv6 is somewhat more rare. Like there are people that have internet connections that actually don't even have access to the IPv6 address range. So there's specific applications where you would specifically use IPv6. But all of that to say, quadruple A is an IPv6 address, single A is an IPv4 address. Yeah. You can purge the cache from Cloudflare. Is there an option for it somewhere? Let's cancel this. Oh, here's caching. I think the issue is it's not even caching the page. It's like caching the redirect. It's caching the redirect itself, not the actual page. Purge everything. Let's try it. Please allow 30 seconds for the changes to take effect. Yeah, on Hetzner, you get an IPv6 for free, but you have to pay for IPv4. Yes, that's actually the growing trend. So AWS Lightsail made an announcement recently where if you are keeping your IPv4 address, the price of your VPS increases by like $2 or $3, maybe $4. It's because we have run out of IPv4 addresses. It's actually a fascinating problem if you haven't really looked into it. So if you look up IP addresses, they oh well, I just leaked my IP address. It's okay. I can very easily change it. Look up IP address on Wikipedia. And they talk about the potential number of available. I can't believe I just leaked my IP address. It's fine. It's fine. Do not DDoS me. I also have a firewall on my network, and I can change my IP. It's fine. You can see here the potential number of network addresses. So yeah, so it's something like, I guess this is only 16 million. Is that true? There's a limited number of IP addresses, given that, let's say, all of the IP addresses from 0.0.0.0 all the way up to 255.255.255.255. And then you actually have to remove some of those ranges because some of them are private. And some of them aren't included in the public IP address range. And that's the total number of IP addresses available for all possible devices. But if you think about modern day, everyone has like multiple devices that need IP addresses. And so we've essentially run out of IP addresses that can be allocated in the IPv4 range, which is why IPv6 was introduced, because it can support billions and billions of devices. Yeah. Cool. It's fine. It's fine, right? It's fine. Let's see. Can you move DNS from Vercel to Cloudflare? I think I've heard previously Vercel doesn't work with Cloudflare DNS. I actually haven't used Vercel to buy any of my domains, but as long as Vercel lets you set custom name servers, you can move to Cloudflare. And I would imagine that they would. Most DNS providers give you the ability to change your name servers. And if you can change your name servers to point to Cloudflare, then that means you can completely manage it from Cloudflare. Now, setting that up in front of a Vercel deployed site, I don't know, that could be a lot trickier. I actually have no idea how that would work or if that would work. But that might be what you need to be worried about is you set up the Cloudflare proxy, but now it needs to make requests to the Vercel function, and maybe you need some more settings there, but yeah. Cool. And what's up, Encodes, who says, can you do a walkthrough of self-hosting Coolify? That's the next video. So I'm looking into Coolify, I'm learning how to use it, and I am making a video on it. That will be the next one that's out. If you find my house, don't say that. So many open ports. There's not. I literally have a firewall appliance, and it doesn't allow outside connections. Come on, people. IPv6 could last for a whole year. Yeah, I mean, right now, we think on the scale of things, we think, we'll never run out of IPv6 addresses, just, but who knows? Yeah. Cool. Oh yeah, and the Cloudflare dev mode does disable itself after 3 hours. Cool. Didn't know, yeah, I mean, they're not as common just because IPv6 addresses aren't as common. What's up, Alec Welcome in, welcome in. It's going well. We're answering questions. I just leaked my IP address. It's just, we're just having a regular old time here. Can I cover reverse proxies? Check out the last video that I did on self-hosting. So in this video, I talk about what a reverse proxy is, and I show you how you can start up a Node.js app on the server running on port 5000, and then reverse proxy that to a domain. So definitely check out this video here. I don't think we have Streamlabs here, but I'll link you the playlist. This playlist has all the videos. You want to look at the one before this, and that talks about reverse proxies. Cool. And Encode says, had a hard time getting Coolify to work. It looks so cool. Thanks for your service. Honestly, me too. But I'm taking a bunch of notes as I set up Coolify, kind of just talking about what I had to go through to get the thing working. And for the video I make, it's going to look like it's going to be the happy path because I'm going to show you exactly what you need to do. But it is taking a lot of back and forth to figure things out. What are my thoughts on Traffic? It's pretty cool. So let me show you Traffic if you have not heard of it. It's very similar to Caddy, and I touched on this in the last video that I did, but one of the nice things about Traffic is they have this built-in web dashboard. And actually, Coolify initially was built on top of Traffic. In the latest version, they're actually adding Caddy support. Currently, it's experimental, but before, it was all based on Traffic. And you can actually, once you set up Coolify, you can enable the Traffic dashboard. This will show you all of your running services. It'll show you your middlewares, everything else. So it's pretty slick. I think it's very similar to Caddy in that a lot of things are zero config. Like you can just say, I want TLS with Let's Encrypt, and it'll automatically provision that certificate for you. But I don't have as much experience with it. But yeah, Traffic is cool. You essentially could use that instead of Caddy. When would you use CloudFront versus Cloudflare? CloudFront, as far as I know, is an AWS offering that is a CDN. I don't think CloudFront has DNS protection. Yeah, so CloudFront is specifically a CDN. CDN and caching is one offering that Cloudflare has. So really, this one tab here is the equivalent of CloudFront. And I haven't really done this with Cloudflare before, but I have worked with CloudFront. And it's an AWS offering. Essentially, you can point it to like an S3 bucket, and it will cache any requests to the files from that bucket. If you set it up as a website, and also distribute those across the world in a CDN. So that's what CloudFront will give you. And then Cloudflare technically also has a caching CDN when you make requests to sites. What current production apps have you worked on? Currently, the Syntax website, because that's where I work. Yeah, so this is what I work on. This is in production. I've added have I added features? I've kind of fixed some things here and there. But that's the site that I'm working on. It's built with SvelteKit. It has a MySQL database. Yeah. Can I go over PM2? Yes, there was a question about PM2 that I'm going to cover, and I will touch on it. Tried IPv6 with Coolify, couldn't get it working. Yeah, related to lack of support in the UK. Yeah, that's what I'm saying is like not everywhere actually has support for IPv6 yet. Eventually they will, and they're going to have to because we have run out of IPv4 addresses, but yeah. Yeah, Paolo says, I think you're right in saying there's a UX problem in general, but I had a really pleasant experience setting Coolify. Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about this in the video that I'm making for Coolify, but really my main takeaway is Coolify is built to kind of streamline using a lot of these tools that we typically use from the command line, like Docker, Traffic, Caddy. Are there others? Some of the various like Docker specific and plugins and Caddy plugins. Coolify is just like a nice UI built on top of those things that tries to make it as seamless as possible to set up what you want. But if you run into issues, you're potentially going to have to dig into like the Docker file or the Docker Compose file or the traffic settings. So once you start hitting issues, it gets harder to figure out where do you go to fix things because it's using those tools under the hood. But yeah. Any suggestions on services that help you monitor your VPS? Sentry. Let's talk about Sentry. How long have I been live? I've been live for almost an hour. Sentry will let you know about any errors that are happening in production. Check it out. Specifically, you can add it to your backend code, you can add it to your front end code, and anytime an error occurs, it is going to log the issue and all the information and stack trace associated with it, and then you can actually go in and debug it. So if errors are happening in production from an app hosted on your VPS, Sentry can help you with that. And Sentry also is self-hosted or self-hostable, so you don't have to use the paid offering. You can host it on your own servers as well. And they have a whole infos about that here. Now, that's just one aspect of monitoring your VPS is like letting you know that errors are happening. You potentially also want to know, well, did a server go down? Different stuff like that. And that might be specific to what you're running on your VPS. But there is this idea of like status pages and alerts. So I think there's a page for awesome status pages. Yeah. I was looking into this because for the Coolify video, I at least want to have one of these set up. But one of these to look at is like Open Status, which is a pretty cool one. It's built with Next.js. And if you've ever seen a website that looks like this, that says like how much uptime do we have and what are some recent events, this is one of the ways of getting that going. So Open Status has a hosted offering, so you can pay them and they'll host the status page for you. But you can also self-host it, because if you go to it, it's literally just like a Next.js app in a repo. And there's a bunch of other status pages as well. And this is what you would want. Essentially, a lot of these status pages, essentially, you would host them on a separate server from your VPS, right? So like if your VPS ever goes down or there's issues or whatever else, that status page software potentially also has some alerting built into it. So you can do like email alerts or SMS alerts. So if a server stops, if the health checks ever go down for a specific server, it will let you know about them. So that's definitely another way to monitor your VPS. Is there a difference between Let's Encrypt SSL and buying one? The only difference is the certificate authority. So yeah, let's look at Let's Encrypt. They are a nonprofit certificate authority. So you may not know this about TLS certificates for websites, but it's all based on this idea that we trust the certificate authorities. And so there are various certificate authorities out there. Before something like Let's Encrypt, you might have heard of like Komodo SSL. There's probably a few others that popped up, but basically they were the certificate authorities, and every machine trusted them, and every machine actually has a list of certificate authorities that they trust. And that means whenever your machine is looking at a TLS certificate, it's going to check to see, was that certificate issued from a certificate authority that it trusts? And every browser comes built in with a list of certificate authorities that it trusts. Authorities. Can we get a list of them? Yeah, so you probably heard of DigiCert, Global Sign, GoDaddy has their own. So basically, every computer has a file on it that says, I trust these certificate authorities. And so when it's looking at a TLS certificate, it's going to say, well, is that TLS certificate issued by one of these certificate authorities? And one of the initiatives of Let's Encrypt was like, we're a nonprofit. We want to become a certificate authority so we can give away TLS certificates for free. So the only difference of certificates obtained from Let's Encrypt is that your certificate authority is this entity called Let's Encrypt versus these other entities like DigiCert and Global Sign and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it is still just a TLS certificate. So yeah. And I think was it the last? Yeah, it was the last video I was making. Technically, they're not called SSL certificates anymore. I still use SSL and TLS interchangeably, but if you want to be technically correct, you should call them TLS certificates because SSL is actually a very outdated technology. It uses TLS encryption, not SSL encryption, but you can still call them SSL certificates. If we hosting on, yeah, so that's the other issue of hosting a status page on your own VPS is if the VPS goes down, then your status page goes down, which is why you have some kind of redundancy, right? You have another server, or potentially you could even host it. Host it on host one thing on AWS because you can trust their infrastructure or something like that. But you would need to host it separately to make sure that it stays up. Yeah, so that's another thing. So status page will let you know if they go down, and then I will show you a PM2, which is a dashboard that shows you some of the processes you have running in the background. And you can potentially set up alerts there too. So like if the CPU usage goes too high or uses too much memory or something like that, that can start alerting you. I'll show that in a little bit. Francois says, the main thing that worries me with VPS maintenance is that all the setup is manual. Any chance to cover automation, backup and restore strategies and migrations? I want to do that eventually. I don't think I'm going to do it anytime soon because I'm going to start working on other types of videos. But yes, that's really the kind of stuff that you need to worry about is, making sure you have backups, making sure it's easy to spin up new servers, making sure you have processes in place to use SSH keys and stuff like that. I want to cover that eventually. I don't see it doing it anytime soon just because we're going to be focusing on more like web dev stuff because we have been doing a lot of VPS stuff lately. Online pseudonym is saying the duration is also a difference. Let's Encrypt certs expire in 3 months. Typically, when you buy a cert, it's valid for 12 months. Yeah, and that's ultimately, I think, something they decided to do to prevent abuse and like overuse. But there are a lot of tools in the ecosystem that can do automatic renewal, especially if you have like your DNS records set correctly and everything. So everything I've used Let's Encrypt for, I've never had to manually review, except for wildcard certificates. Wildcard certificates do have to be manually renewed, but there are tools for automating those as well. But yeah, that's a good distinction to make. But ultimately, the validity time is up to the certificate authority. Yeah. But why does my browser trust Let's Encrypt? Because actually, I don't know the hierarchy of it. Like, I don't know where it goes beyond just being a certificate authority. But because they are one, they are officially listed by all major browsers as a valid validator of and creator of certificates. That's why. Yeah. What's up, Moshiko? Good to see you. Halaka Noob says, I love the PM2. Saw it on your video and already using it. Nice. Appreciate that, Francois. Does Sentry have an easy migration path from self-hosting to the cloud offering? That is something that I do not know, but they probably have some docs on it. Let's just see. I would assume so because it's in our it's in our business to potentially make money if you don't want to self-host anymore. Productionizing? It's probably possible. I'll try to find a link for you and send it to you later. B-Mine says, I still call it SSL certificates. I called it SSL certificates until I started preparing this video. Just because I saw people talking about how it's technically not SSL certificates anymore. What's up, Amir? Welcome in. All right, let's keep going. Here we go. That was a lot of down the rabbit hole, but that's okay. And we're going to talk about PM2 now. So Relaster Da says, this is very nice. I learned a lot. I love PM2 and all the reports it gives. Is there another way to monitor the application without being SSH'd into the VPS? So let me show you. So I showed you in the last video how to use PM2, which is a process manager. And essentially it manages background things running in the background. So if I SSH back into my server, and we just do a PM2 list, PM2 is managing these two Node.js services. So I have an API hosted here and an API hosted here. And if they ever crash, PM2 will automatically restart them. And PM2 keeps track of all the logs. So if I do PM2 logs, for example, API, we can see all of the requests that come in. And then if we go to the site, so if I go to example api.not.localhost.net, that request comes in and we see the logs here. So it's showing us the logs here. It's storing them in a specific spot. If this server ever crashes, it's going to automatically restart it. So PM2 is pretty cool for that. And it's built with Node.js, and you typically use it to host Node.js things, but it can host any kind of process. In the last video, I talked about how PM2 is an option, but you can also use something like systemd. So systemd is built into Linux, and it allows you to create these services, and it'll automatically restart them. But let me show you some of the other things that PM2 can do. Now, PM2 Plus is a paid offering. So if you look at their pricing, it actually is $40 a month. It's kind of pricey, but I'll show you what it can do and you can decide if that's actually worth it. But they give you a dashboard like this that you can access externally. So I just signed up for the free trial and I have my instance connected. And so if I go to this web page, it will show me those same processes, but I don't need to be SSH'd into the server. So I can see how much memory the process is using. I can restart it with like one click. Look at that. I can see all of the logs. So it's pretty slick to be able to see all of the running processes on your server. And they have a bunch of other features that I haven't dug into as well. And they have like profiling. Somebody earlier asked about monitoring. They very likely have a way, alerting. Look at that. So they, again, it's a paid offering because there's a lot of features that they're adding here. But they do have a way of saying, oh, well, if my process uses too much memory, send me an alert or whatever else. So it's pretty slick. I guess maybe I'm not on the free trial anymore. Yeah, and I think ultimately, basically what has to happen is there is some process running on this machine now that I've connected it that is very regularly sending all of the logs and everything else to this remote server, so that way I can go in and see the actual status. So that's a thing. Now, again, it's a paid offering. You can decide whether or not the price is you're willing to pay for it. But I will say there are some open source projects that people have tried to do a similar thing. So I haven't used any of these, but if you just search GitHub for PM2 Web UI, you can see there's a few popular ones that people have created where these are completely open source, and it basically just gives you a web page with similar features where it kind of shows you all the stuff happening inside of PM2. So these might be worth checking out. I haven't tried any of them, but it gives you a similar thing. And one thing you could do is if you're going to host it on the same server, is you could just like reverse proxy it to a domain. But again, if your server goes down, then your entire PM2 monitoring goes down. So this idea of like a remote way of sending off your logs and metrics, that way if this server ever goes down, this server over here is still able to know about it. That's potentially something you want to set up. But that is a possibility with PM2. So yeah, I'll jump back over to the comments, see if you have anything else for me. Yeah. I call them HTTPS certificates. I think that's the better way to go because you don't run into the issue of accidentally saying SSL or TLS. They are HTTPS certificates. Yeah. Well, honestly, I don't think it's worse. I think it's okay to say that. What hardware am I using for my home server? I've recently started to build my Raspberry Pi mini rack. I haven't spun up my home server, but because we're here, I'll grab it. It's so it's a Dell Precision T5610, and I'll be honest, I got really excited about like home lab and self-hosting. And I set it up with a RAID array and a bunch of stuff, but then I didn't have the time to work on it, so it's just been sitting there. Ah, so TikTok is having me verify that I'm a human. That's really weird. Okay. Hopefully TikTok is still live. Um, so if you're looking into home labs, or if you're looking into self-hosting at home, home lab is what you want to search for. People talk about it all the time, like the kind of servers you can use, like Raspberry Pis or just a laptop. Specifically, this Dell Precision is like enterprise level desktop. And the reason I chose that is because it's not super loud. It still has like an enterprise grade CPU. I think it has like a Xeon Intel CPU. So it still has to cool it. And so the fans do spin up. But if you've ever heard a real server, the fans get so loud and you don't want that sitting next to your desk. So yeah. Can I compare PM2 to supervisor? I haven't heard of supervisor. Supervisor D? Is that what it is? Ah, I have never used it, so I can't compare it. But it's good to know that it exists. Yeah. Yeah, Scott mentioned that to me. So his home lab is running off of a Mac Mini. Is that what you have Coolify running on? But yeah, that's awesome. My plan is to make the Raspberry rack as a cluster so I can learn more about K8s and Linux. Yeah, I've seen some tutorials on YouTube about that where people get a bunch of Raspberry Pis because they're cheap, and then you configure them all in a cluster. Yeah. I know people say you need Linux, but Mac is silent and pretty powerful for the price. Just not as many available tools. Yeah. How to burn your retinas? Oh, okay. Because the website was so. Yeah, I agree. Paolo says, speaking of which, in theory, you could host Coolify on a Raspberry Pi. You can do that with tunneling without opening any port. One thing I was curious, though, is if I tunnel, should I be able to do it without a static IP? Yeah, that's one of the. So that's another offering from Cloudflare, is the Cloudflare tunnel. And in a way, it's kind of like dynamic DNS as well. So because everything is going through the tunnel, as long as you have that client running on whatever you want to tunnel, its IP address can change. Like your home IP address doesn't have to be static because it's always allowing the connection via Cloudflare, and then the Cloudflare thing that you set up has a static IP address or an IP address that gets updated if it does change automatically. Yeah. What's up, Killer? I know I can install Docker on a VPS and run my images in production, but continuous deployment would be a pain. Is there an open source solution that makes this as easy as fly.io? Do you mean like rebuilding images, repulling the latest image, that kind of thing, Killer? Is that what you're talking about? You have two. Wait. You're human. Are you talking about how I no longer I got the thing, decided I wanted to do it, and then just like ran out of time or didn't have the time to do it. Stony says I have two Dell PowerEdge Blade servers and they're loud. Yeah. Can you give me an overview of how to migrate to ESLint 9? I haven't done it yet. I thought they had an automated tool that could do it. I thought there was a script you could run to automatically upgrade, but ESLint 9, I believe they've completely switched to this idea of composable config files instead of like your RC file. But yeah, watch me run Coolify on my phone. That's great. All right, let's get back into it. Next question comes from multiple people, and we're actually about to talk about how to do CI/CD on a server. So Yushinai Hyansho says, next video should be CI/CD with GitHub Actions. Ralaiser Da also says, another way we deploy Vite and other statically built applications is to build them with GitHub Actions and then copy them to the VPS. I never tried, but I've seen examples online. Yeah, in the last video, we had a static React app that had a build process, and I showed you that technically you can just run npm run build on the VPS itself, But if that build process requires a lot of CPU, the other services running on your VPS could potentially be degraded when you're needing to build that front end site. So offloading that to some build server is definitely a way to prevent reducing that load on the server. And Juan Moses Trijo says, excellent quality. Thank you for this. Question, how would I set up automatic deployment in my VPS? And Juanes Salom says, these videos are amazing. Great job. Would love to learn how you would approach CI/CD. Let's talk about it. And I have a few links for you. So first of all, one thing you could do is run something that automatically syncs your Git repos. Now, this will work if it's just like a static website, right? So if you're serving up static files and that lives in a Git repo, and then you make a push to that Git repo, if you pull those changes on the server, you don't need to restart the server, you don't need to rebuild anything. As long as those latest changes are pulled in, then the latest static files will be served up. And there are tools that can automatically sync Git repos. So Git sync actually comes from the Kubernetes team, and it installs a daemon that is just always running in the background. And instead of using git clone, you use git sync clone. And after doing that, it will keep the repo in sync. I believe it does it does a poll to determine if there are latest changes. And so it's constantly running in the background. It's like, are there latest changes on the repo? Are there latest changes? And when there are, it pulls them in. And so git sync from Kubernetes is one way to do that. And then there's also this one called git auto sync, which comes from Git journal. And it works in a similar way where instead of doing git clone, you do git auto sync clone. And I think they also have like a sync command, and then there's like a daemon that can run in the background. If you're still watching, Scott, we should add daemon as a word to see how people pronounce it. Because I've heard this pronounced as like demon or daemon. I think lately I've just been saying daemon. But both of these tools are running on your server, and they will automatically pull any changes into a Git repo. And so that is one step of continuous deployment in a way. But for a lot of use cases, you need more than just that, right? Not only do you want to pull in the latest changes, you potentially also need to run a build and other things like that. So one of the things we can potentially do this with is webhooks. So GitHub has this idea of creating a webhook on your repo so that anytime something is merged into main, the GitHub servers will make a post request to some other server, and that some other server is now alerted that there are changes on the repo. And you can do this with any repo on GitHub. So I'm here in this notlocalhost.net repo. If you go into settings and then webhooks, you can specify a URL and like a secret that you could potentially validate on your server. And then now all you need is some server listening at that specific endpoint. And it can be written with anything. You could write it with Node, you could write it with Go, you could write it with Python. As long as it's a server that can receive post requests, it will be alerted when some change happens on your GitHub repo. And other services like Bitbucket and GitLab, they all have a similar way of creating these kind of like webhooks. And so this is one way to start with the automation of pulling latest changes or running the latest build or something like that. So you could set up a webhook, and then you could write a custom server that listens for that post request, and then when it receives that post request, it just runs a script, right? It could run a script that builds your app, that restarts the app, those kinds of things. And that script can do literally whatever you want. So that's one way of going about it. But there is this really cool tool called Webhook, and it's written with Go, but you can just run it as a process on your machine. And so you install this. Now it's always running in the background, and you would potentially set up like a reverse proxy setup so that you have an actual URL that GitHub can make a post request to, and they have a really easy way of configuring it. So you give your deployments unique IDs. Like I would create a deployment called like notlocalhost.net, and then you can specify a script that should be run. So for example, if we're trying to deploy like a React app, we could add the webhook, make sure that this is running on our server, create a reverse proxy with Caddy to put it behind a subdomain, and then write a script that does npm run build, and then pm2 restart, or like restart the service with whatever you're using. But that custom script could be there. And so this project has a ton of stars. It is very popular, and basically you could use this in conjunction with a Caddy reverse proxy to now automatically pull in changes and build whenever there's a merge into main on your main repo. So that's one way to go about it. Now, the other aspect here is you're still running those builds on your VPS, and that's not ideal, because if it's a very heavy build process, then everything else running on the VPS will potentially, your services will be degraded because your VPS is spending all of its CPU trying to build these apps. So for that, you potentially would want to introduce like a build server, some kind of intermediary. And a fairly easy way to do that is with something like GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions does have a free tier, but this might be even with self-hosting, this might be one of the best ways to get a build server is just by using GitHub Actions, because you could create a GitHub action that whenever you get a PR, you run your tests, you run your build, and then you combine this with the SSH action. And that could SSH into your server and like load the built files itself. Or you could do it all on the server itself. So you could create a GitHub action that uses this SSH action and you can see that you can specify a script. You can do literally anything you want here. So in the GitHub action, you could actually have a script that says SSH into the server, build it, or pull the latest changes, build it, and then restart the service. But you could do that with SSH actions. And then I guess if you're not on GitHub, other services have GitHub action style things. But beyond that, it really, if you want to roll your own, it kind of would come down to setting up a separate VPS and then just setting up SSH keys so that the VPSs could talk to each other, right? So you could have the webhook server running on a separate VPS. When it receives its hook that things have changed, it can pull the latest changes, run the build, and then from there, if it has an SSH key to be able to connect to some other server, it can SCP those files over to the other server, and then you could run a script on the remote server that then restarts the service. I don't know. It would be very manual to do, but basically you can use all of these building blocks to kind of get that same automated deployment and build process that you're kind of used to. The other thing is to like use a tool that kind of mostly does it for you. So we're going to talk about Coolify in the next video, and they have this idea of GitHub integration. So you can set up an app that points to a GitHub repo, and then you set up a webhook. So Coolify will create that webhook endpoint for you. They basically have software running behind the scenes that works very similar to this webhook tool that I'm showing you here. And then within Coolify, you have build settings for your app. So when it receives that webhook, it can rebuild the app, it can restart it, it can do all the things that you need. So there's a lot of ways to go about it, but ultimately that's how we get automated deployment, automated integration. And like I was saying, you if you use all these building blocks, you can have a separate build server. You can kind of like move beyond the basics there. Wes says daemon, nice. So we were talking about daemon versus daemon. All right, let me catch up on the chat. But that's how you get CI/CD on your own custom server. Let me know what questions you have. Yeah, Coolify also provides this. Yeah, so that's the last thing that we touched on is if you want automated GitHub integration and everything else, Coolify has that. And Coolify has an experimental feature right now of build servers. So I think that's actually the next question we're going to get into. Yeah, well, at some point we have a question about build servers, which is what I talked about, a separate server that does the building so you don't use those resources on your main VPS. Yeah. It's clearly pronounced daemon? Demon? Laravel Forge is perfect for CI/CD. It allows you to deploy from your CLI. Oh, cool. Yeah, I guess one thing I didn't touch on is, I mean, I don't know what the self-hosted versions of these are these days, but back in the day, I used a thing called Jenkins CI. So Jenkins is self-hostable. I think it's built on top of Java. And Jenkins is what we used before things like Travis CI and like GitHub Actions and all these other more like hosted platforms were created. And you host this on your own server, and it has ways of configuring all this stuff. So like it can listen for updates to a repo, it can do the builds, it can do all that stuff. And so I don't know, I'm not up to date. I don't know what the modern equivalent of Jenkins is, or if people are still using Jenkins if they're hosting their own CI. But in a way, Jenkins is kind of like your own GitHub Actions. You basically can configure it in the same way that you configure Actions, but it's running on your own server. What's up, Renato? Welcome in. Oh, we answered your question if you missed it. We were talking about PM2. We do that for a React frontend and a Laravel backend. Nice. Yeah, oh yeah, you saw it? Nice, nice. Anyone have recommendations for a 2.5 gig NIC, which is a network integrated device thingy? I don't. Wanted Salome says, my first thought was GitHub Actions, but the webhook package also looks really interesting. Yeah, let me get you all of these links. So, yeah, the webhook one is a little more configuration, but like I said, it's you install it, create a reverse proxy to it, and then you just add a little config, and it's kind of like good to go. And then the other thing are like these Git autosync tools. And also the SSH action. So if you're going to use GitHub Actions, the SSH action is a good place to start. What's up, Mohammed? Welcome in. Yeah, I have a lot of tabs open. I do. Deployment, rolling out, restarting on failure. I guess I would need a private registry as well. Yeah. Technically, if you're on the GitHub Pro plan, they actually do have a private registry for Docker images. If you didn't know that, you can host Docker images on GitHub, like the GitHub Packages feature. But all of what I just talked about, I think would apply here as well, but you're going to have to combine that with like the Docker CLI and the idea of like, instead of just running a build with npm run build, instead you would run the Docker build command and stuff like that. So yeah. Yeah, GitHub Actions are a pain to debug. Scott was dealing with that recently. He was setting up like Markdown validation in a GitHub action, and being able to debug it is like you want to run those actions locally first to make sure that the stuff is working so you don't have to keep pushing to the remote. But yeah. Adam Collier says, good night from the UK. We'll catch up on the rest. Cool. I think I'm answering one of your questions. But yeah, we'll see ya. Thank you for dropping in. And thank you. It's no fun. All right. Let's keep going. Next question is from Amir Ziai. It says, love the series. Looking forward to seeing solutions for better isolation between the apps like nested virtual servers, Docker, etc. And Patexer says, this is awesome. I would love to see how you would set up and manage Docker and a DB on the VPS. Yes. I think it would be fun to just install Docker and show you how it works. So I did do a video called Start Using Docker Today. And this shows you the basics of Docker, but really with a focus on doing it in development. I don't really talk about like building and publishing images and like pulling in those images and stuff like that. But most of what I talk about with the Docker CLI and Docker Compose, you can do all of that on your VPS. So let's do it. Let's do it live. I'm going to install Docker and then just like spin up a container and then reverse proxy it through Caddy. Because if you saw in the last video, I talked about how Caddy could reverse proxy anything running on a specific port. As long as we can expose whatever's running in our Docker container to a port, we can reverse proxy it through Caddy just like we do any other app. So let's go. Let's install it on Ubuntu. Wait, I don't want desktop. I want just Docker. How do I get that? Docker desktop is specific. I mean, I guess technically you can run it. Yeah, Docker engine. That's what I want. Docker engine. All right. We're running on Ubuntu. I don't have Docker on this machine at all. So here we go. We need to add the repository. I'm going to mute my mic while I type in my sudo password, but give me a second. All right, we're rocking and rolling. So if you didn't follow the series, this is a server that's running Ubuntu, and we set up a few services just running on it. But now I'm installing Docker, and we will just get a container up and going, and then reverse proxy it with Caddy. So let's run this. Cool. And then, oh, well, so sorry, that just updated our package list. So that made it so that we can install Docker. And now we should be able to install the Docker Community Edition. Will this also install the daemon? Yes, yes, it will. It's interesting we have to use sudo to run it though. Actually, I don't want to do that. I should be able to add my user to the Docker group, and then I won't have to run it with sudo. Let's see. Do I use npm serve? Not sure what you mean by that. It depends on the app that you're running. npm serve. I see what you're saying. There's potentially apps that have those npm scripts, so that if you want to run them in production, which script do you use? I think that's what you're asking. I talk about this in my last video. So I show that you typically don't want to do like npm run dev. A lot of times, especially even if it's a static website, you don't even want to do npm serve or npm preview, because you want Caddy to be your static file server. Like Node.js technically can be a static file server, but Caddy is a lot faster at it. So if you have a site that ultimately is just static files, like a React app built with Vite or Webpack or Rollup or any of these things, like it's not Next.js that requires a server-side runtime, you can just do the build and then run the static app directly with Caddy. I think that's what you're asking. Astronautilus says, your series inspired me to finally update my VPS. I also use Docker with Caddy to host a Discord bot, so I'm interested to see how you're going to do it. Nice. Yeah. Will this install the daemon? You had to install the you shouldn't have to install the desktop. Yeah, so it is. So we can actually do sudo docker ps. It installed the daemon. It's running. But look at me. I'm going off script. I'm not even following the tutorial. I want the CJ user to be able to run Docker commands without being sudo. And I think to do that, I can just add my user to the Docker group. So let's do a sudo user mod. We're going to add the group Docker. Okay, I have to look it up because I actually, I guess I could use TLDR. I can't remember if it's group name first. I think it's group name and then username. Let's TLDR it. What? Am I thinking of the wrong command? Okay, it is group user. Cool. So now that CJ is in the Docker group, I'm going to exit my SSH session. And when we reload, my user is now in the Docker group. So I should be able to run Docker without being sudo. Yes, this is what you want. I really don't like having to do sudo all the time. And especially you don't want to run those commands as root. Like Docker is running as the Docker user. So great. And if you miss that, the command is usermod AAG Docker, the group, and then the name of your user, and then now you can run Docker without using sudo. Okay, so we have Docker running. Let's just do the hello world. I don't think this starts up an HTTP server. I think it literally just like spits some stuff out, but let's see. It's gonna pull that image, and yeah, it just says hello world. Cool. But let's start up a Docker container that actually runs a website. Again, I'm going off script, but I think I want to run an app that I ran in the Docker video that has a Redis database and then a Node.js API. Let's do that. So I have an app called Pokemon Cacher. And so this is a Node.js API that caches responses to the Poke API in a Redis database. And I showed how to set this up with Docker. So if you look at the with Docker Compose branch, I have this Docker Compose file. Actually, no, this doesn't Dockerize the API. Does anyone know of a quick and easy API, like Node.js API, that I could spin up that yeah, do it live? Dockerize the app. I guess I could do it live. I guess I've been live for an hour and a half. How many more questions do we have? Let's at least get the Redis database running just so I can show that happen, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I'm gonna clone this repo. I'm gonna use the public clone because I don't want to set up a deploy key. And so over on the server, I'm gonna go into my host directory, and so this is where I have all the apps that I have running, and we're gonna clone this down. And then we'll go in, and I need to check out the with Docker Compose branch. Yeah, so I'm on the branch, and now we have this Docker Compose file. So let's just spin up the Redis database. And we'll see it happen. So it's going to pull that Redis image, and then it should start the database. Nice. We have Redis literally running on this server, which is pretty cool. So it's as simple as that. I think as long as you can run Docker things, if something is binding to a specific port, then you can run it, you can reverse proxy it. So we want to set up a Docker file for this. I'm just going to do this locally because I want to be able to edit it in VS Code. So let me get that all set up. Cool. So we're on the with Docker Compose branch. Let's open it up with VS Code. And we want to create a Docker file. So essentially, I have a Node.js app here written in TypeScript, and I want to put that into a Docker container. I talk about it like I'm going to do it from scratch. I'm just going to go copy paste. So we need a Docker file. We need to say which image we're pulling from. So I'm going to say from Node LTS. So that'll grab the long-term support version. We'll try to do the basics from memory, and then I'm going to just copy paste from an existing Docker file. We want to copy in the package.json. So what we need is the Docker image needs to have package.json and package.lock so it can then install dependencies. So we're going to say copy package star.json into the directory. And before that, we need to set our working directory. So we'll say workdir, and then I'm just going to set this to /app. So it's going to put all of the files associated with the application in the /app folder. Copy the package.json. It's going to then do an npm install. So that'll install all the dependencies. And then from there, we can copy the rest of the app. So we'll do copy everything into the /app. So now all of the stuff lives inside of the Docker image. That's pretty much it. In the Start Using Docker video, I talk about how technically we really only want this in development because when we're running this Node.js app in production, we technically want to be running this dist folder, which has all of that TypeScript built into JavaScript. And so technically we can create a container that only has the built files inside of it. So let's go do a copy paste. So I'm going to grab this repo. I think it's called the Backpack Debuggers. And I specifically set up a Docker file that has multiple stages inside of it. Yeah, check it out. So we have the base image. Actually, I will talk about this. So instead of using the LTS image directly, if we use the Alpine image, it's actually going to be a lot smaller because the base Node.js image is actually built on top of Debian, and I think that image alone is like 1 gigabyte. But if you use the Alpine image, it's something like 200 or 300 megabytes, so it's going to be a much smaller image. And then we're using multi-stage builds, so all of this is going to be our base image, and then we can pull from there. So I think I'm going to grab the rest of this from here. And I'll talk about what this is doing. So this right here is the base image. The base image only has the dependencies inside of it. It has all of the node modules, but it doesn't have any of the source code. Then we create a separate image called the dev image. this is based on the base image, but now this also has all of the source code inside of it. Because when we're in dev, we want to have all the source code with all our configs and everything else. So that's the dev image. And then you can think about each of these as a separate thing that isn't based on everything above it. It's only based on the image we're specifically basing it on. So from there, we have an image called the build image or build step. And this is based on dev. So dev has all of the files in the repo. It also has all of the dependencies that were installed. And so now within the dev container, we have the ability to run npm run build because we have our dependencies, we have all of our source codes. And then when that command is run, it's going to spit it out into this dist folder. And so now the dist folder lives inside of the build container. From there, if we want to create our production image, we base it off of the base image. So if you remember, the base image only has the dependencies inside of it. And then we copy that build folder into the production image. So our production image only has dependencies and the dist folder. It doesn't have all the extra source code. Okay, so this is the Docker file that we want, and then we want to be able to run this from Docker Compose. So I'm gonna save this, and then I want to add some configuration to our Docker Compose. So right now our Docker Compose only has the database service. We also want the app service, and we will say just build the current directory. So it's going to look at that Docker file and it's going to build that, and then we need to give it a few other settings to specify that it should use the prod image here. Let's grab that from our Docker Compose. So here we're saying target that prod step from the Docker file and use that from the Docker file. So let's just copy this. We should be good to go. So we have our prod image. And so specifically in our Docker Compose, because we said use this, it's going to run through the build and finally it'll do this build step. But now this is the image that will be used whenever we're running it. We need to expose some ports. So 5,000 seems fine. I'm going to go ahead and change it to something I know is not going to be in use. We'll change it to 7,000. Actually, we'll use the port environment variable. So whatever we specify in the .env, that's what it's going to expose. And then right here, we'll pass the port environment variable in. And then for this app, we also need the Redis connection information in our environment variable. So essentially, these two values here need to be specified so that it can connect. And we'll bring this in from the .env. Okay, we're running in production. We have our port, we have our host for Redis, our port for Redis. We have it that it depends on the database, which is our Redis image here. I think that's all we need. I guess I can run it locally just to make sure it works before we push it up. So if I do a Docker Compose up, I need to start up a Docker engine real quick. And I'll catch up on chat because I did a bunch of stuff. Am I going to run Docker init? I have not run Docker init before. Does that create a Docker file? Yeah, I saw that too. There is an app someone created that you just tell it about a thing and it will Dockerize it. I guess which is relevant because I've been learning about Coolify, and they use a thing called Nix packs. And this is a project that tries to automatically, we're getting blinded here, tries to automatically figure out what your app is and then can run it inside of a container. So I think, yeah, this has support for so many different languages and it can automatically containerize them. So that's another thing that we can use. Node is built from Alpine anyway. It's built from Debian, and I only know that because in the tutorial, I accidentally used that and it was like a gigabyte for the image. Yeah. What's up, Levi? Yeah, thank you. Oh, I was wrong. Shouldn't the last one based on dev, not the base image, or am I wrong? Let's talk about it because I think I'm right, but the last one is based on the base image. So from base, which means we're going to get all of this. The only thing we're getting from the build step is specifically this folder here. So because we say from base, you can think of it as an image that only has this here. And then we're copying files from this build phase, but those are the only files we're copying is from build. And actually, I made a mistake here because this is outputting to the dist folder, not the build folder. So this actually needs to be from, well, no, here. Okay, never mind. So from the build step, copy the dist folder into app. Yeah. Hopefully that clarified things. Cody says, shouldn't build images on a cheap VPS or server you can run out of memory, build and push to a registry? Yes, I mean, for this, it should work. I mean, even the VPS that I'm running here, I think it has like 2 gigs of RAM and 2 CPUs. It's pretty small. So it should be able to run this, but for anything bigger, yeah, you're going to run out of memory, but I think we should be good. Why is Alpine not the default? There's some things that just aren't built into Alpine or that you might need from the DB images versus the Alpine image. Okay, so this Docker file looks good. Our Docker Compose looks good. Let's try it. I need to make sure that my env has all these things. So the env also needs the port variable. And I'm going to set that to 7,000. And actually, we'll do it both ways. Because the port inside the container is going to be this. And then we want to expose that port to that same port on our machine. So I think that's what we want. Let's see. Docker Compose up. Okay, so it's right now, it's pulling the DB image and then also it's building the Node.js image. So it did the npm install. Nice. Yeah, only thing is my application code is saying, hey, you don't have a Redis username or a Redis password. So I think I just need to make sure that I pass these in as well. Even though they're empty, because by default, we're using Redis in insecure mode, so it doesn't have a username and password, but we'll still pass them in, but they're going to be empty when they get specified. Okay, so I'm gonna kill that, restart it. Cool, so it's trying to connect to Redis, but in my .env, I said it should connect on localhost. That's not the case anymore because we actually want to connect to DB inside the container because a localhost inside that container actually means that container. I want this value to be DB, so that way it connects to the Redis container, because Docker creates a network and then internally to this node image here, DB is going to resolve to the IP address of this container over here. All right. First try, third try, but we do have an app running on port 7000. And I think if we go to API, V1, Pokemon, and then a Pokemon name like Pikachu. Yeah, so this is actually caching that via the Poke API. And if I refresh, it should be instant because it's now pulling that from the Redis cache. Okay, we're good to go. We got our Docker file, we got our Docker Compose. I'm going to push this codes up and then try building these images on the server. It will be interesting to see, can my server handle building this node image? But let's do it. Okay, so I push the changes up, and honestly, you're kind of seeing a manual workflow of if I made changes to a repo and that repo exists on the server here, as long as I'm on the right branch, I can just do a git pull, and I have now manually synced the changes to the server here. But now that we have that, let's update our .env. I'm just going to copy what I have locally. And node env is going to be production. And let's start it up. Okay, so it's pulling the Redis image and the Alpine image. Actually, I mean, while all of this is happening, let's SSH in, and we can do a top. You can see that even SSH is slow right now. We're at 67% memory usage. But if you do top, you can see all of your processes. So yeah, my CPU right now with this build and pull is at 78%. And I only have 648 megabytes free of memory. So this is why you want a build server, because if I had actual users using my VPS while this build process is happening, everything slows down. Like all of the other processes on the machine have less resources. That's a thing for sure. But once this finishes, you should see this CPU usage drop way down because it's done with the build, and then it's just kind of like idling there. But yeah, building a TypeScript app, 70% CPU usage. Yeah, I mean, you can tell this server is not great. It took 42 seconds to install the npm dependencies. All right, so now it's running. Our CPU, yeah, so now that it's built everything, it's running in the background, CPU usage drops way down because it's literally just idling there, right? So this thing is running now on port 7,000 and we're good to go. But at this point, now because the app is running, we need to set up a reverse proxy, right? We don't have any way of accessing port 7,000, so we want a reverse proxy. So let's go set up a DNS record. I'm gonna hide my screen for just a second. I mean, you can see my screen here, but you can't see all the details. Okay. All right, we're back. I want another A record here that points to my servers, so that way I can reverse proxy to that specific domain. So I'm going to add a record. It's going to be an A record. We're going to call this Pokemon Cacher. And we're going to point it at the IP address. Again, I could use a CNAME here. I'm just going to do the IP address. Low TTL, save it. And then we also need a www record. So if someone goes to www.pokemoncacher.notlocalhost.net, we want that to redirect without the www. And so we'll use a CNAME here. So this is a scenario where, hey, when you go here, I want you to resolve the DNS here. Like this. So that points to pokemoncacher.notlocalhost.net. We look up that record, and that points to the IP address. So this should be good to go. Now that we have the DNS records, we need to set up a Caddy config that will specifically work for these websites. So I'm on the VPS. Let's go to etc Caddy. And then I want to create a file inside of sites available. So technically, I don't need to be in the folder, but what I do want to do is I want to copy one of those files. Like when we set up the APIs, it's going to be almost exactly the same. So like if we look at this holidays API, it is a reverse proxy listening on a specific port. It'll show any errors that pop up, and it's going to redirect www to the root subdomain. So I want something exactly like that. So I'm just going to copy this file. So I'm going to copy holidays and put that into Pokemon Cacher. Cool. And now I'm going to edit that. And I specifically want to set the domain here. So the root domain is Pokemon Cacher. We're going to reverse proxy it to 7,000 because that's the port that we exposed from the Docker container. And then we're going to redirect www.pokemoncacher.notlocalhost.net into Pokemon Cacher. .notlocalhost.net. Cool. This should be all we need. So we'll oh dang it. I'm not sudo. I thought I was. There we go. So PokemonCacher.notlocalhost.net is a reverse proxy to port 7,000, which is where we have that Docker container running, and we're going to redirect www to the root. This should be good. Now the way we have this set up, I want to link that file from sites available into sites enabled. So let's do this. And we'll change the file name. So we want to create that file called Pokemon Cacher. And it's going to be from the file called Pokemon Cacher. Great. So if we look in sites enabled, there is now a link to that file. If we reload Caddy, the reverse proxy should be running, and that should proxy any requests that come into port 7000 to the thing running inside the Docker container. So let's do it. Sudo service caddy reload. All right, let's give it a go. If we go to pokemoncacher.notlocalhost.net, it's working. So it is reverse proxying these requests into that Docker container. And if we go to API v1 Pikachu, Pokemon/Pikachu. Yeah, good to go. And we can see in the logs, yeah, other people are coming here. So, people watching live are coming to the site as well. I'll give you the link here. Caddy time, yeah. Yeah. Honestly, I'm gonna make the executive decision. Yeah, I will mod you, Stony Eagle. We know Stony, we trust them, and they're on Twitch a lot. So please use your best judgment to moderate things. Thank you, Stony. But we're good to go. And so, I mean, really the main thing I kind of wanted to show here. Ooh, you got Bulbasaur. Oh, you spelled it wrong. You're missing an A in Bulbasaur. But the main thing I wanted to show is, as long as something is running on a port, no matter what it is, it doesn't have to be a Node app, it could be inside a container, it could be a Go app or whatever else. If it's on a port, we can reverse proxy it through Caddy. And so use what you know about Docker to... I better not show these logs. People are... No, actually, so here's the other interesting thing. I'm killing the containers now. And this is one thing I should actually update. So I'm killing these containers. Once the container is down, we're going to get a bad gateway, right? So the container is no longer running and exposing port 7000. If we try going to it again, bad gateway, right? So Caddy is trying to reverse proxy it, but the thing isn't running on port 7000. There's nothing to respond to those requests. Now, one thing you want to do is, if you're going to be using Docker Compose in this way, is you actually want to set to restart to always, because if this server were to crash, it would just stay crashed. And so there's actually a setting in Docker called restart. I think you can do it like this, always. And that way, if this thing ever crashes, it's going to automatically restart. And so you get a similar experience to something like PM2, where it manages the process. Let me make sure I'm specifying this right. Restart policies. Restart, no. I think I did that right. So if we are going to be running this in production like this, and I wouldn't recommend this for big sites. For bigger sites, you're going to want some kind of container orchestrator or something like that. But if you are going to be running Docker Compose, restart always at a minimum. And then you can do a compose up -D, and that'll run it in daemon mode or detached mode. And so now I still have access to my terminal here, but I can see that these Docker containers are running, and I shouldn't get a bad gateway anymore. Yeah, so now the API is running again. Cool. I'll answer any questions you have in chat, and then we'll keep moving. Yeah. I thought you had to create a whole network. No idea you could just say DB. I do believe Docker Compose creates a network for you, so you don't have to. Or I know that you can specify custom networks down here, but by default, all of the services listed in a Docker Compose are going to be put within the same network. So that's definitely why that works. Can I share my bash RC aliases? I actually just, I use Zish, I use Zish now. And it's pronounced Zish, not Z-shell. But if you check out my dot files, I think I updated these. Yeah, you can see my Zish RC. And I just have a few aliases. These I don't use as often, but I use these git commit aliases pretty often. Technically, you get some aliases when you enable the git plugin in Zish. I know I'm triggering people by saying Zish. You get aliases, but these are some aliases I got used to that aren't built into the git plugin. But yeah, you can see all my dot files here. What's up, Murdoch? Welcome in. Can you give 000 instead of localhost? No, because 0.0.0 also means the container itself. So the way to think about that is app is literally it's a Linux computer. It's a container, but think about it as its own computer. And if it references localhost, it's always going to be referencing itself. And so 0.0.0 technically is localhost as well. It's just referencing itself. We need to reach outside of this container to this other container, which is why we need its IP address. Now, it's possible to get the private IP address, and you could actually specify that. But this is just a nicety of Docker and Docker Compose is that you can use this host name, and now internally in this container, you don't need to know the IP address. Yeah. Is Bulbasaur? No, you have to. I'll show you how to spell Bulbasaur. Bulbasaur, like that. Yeah, there you go. Bulbasaur is a Pokemon. Restart the DB2. Yeah, you technically can do that. You're completely right. I kind of just trust it to run because it is. I mean, yeah, I say that, but yeah, you're right. We probably should have restart always on the database as well. Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Tony. I did mod you. I don't know if you're still sticking around. Cool. Anything else? Anything else? All right. I think we have just a couple more questions and then we'll get out of here. Yeah, we talked about CI/CD and we just talked about Docker. And again, all I wanted to show you is as long as something is running on a port, whatever that is, you can reverse proxy it through Caddy. Okay, and this is related. So Sergeef is saying, awesome video. Can you use Caddy as a reverse proxy for Docker containers? Yes, so exactly like I set up. You don't have to do anything special. As long as the port is exposed, you're good to go. And X Saman says, it would be interesting to see if we can automatically link running apps in Docker to Caddy ports. This could eliminate the need for explicitly mapping ports in the reverse proxy setup. There is a project for that. So imagine this. You have a VPS and you have a bunch of Docker containers all running on a specific port. What if you could add a configuration tag in your Docker Compose that specifies the domain name, and then you have something listening for that, and if it sees that a Docker container exposed a port and it has that tag, it can automatically add the Caddy config? That exists. That exists. So there is this tool called Caddy Docker Proxy. And fun fact, Coolify is actually using this under the hood. But the whole idea with this is it's running in the background, and then you can add tags to your Docker Compose files. Labeled. They're called labels. So, for example, this service has a Caddy label of whoami.example.com. So that's automatically going to create a Caddy configuration that points to that domain and set up SSL and everything else. And then all of the properties supported inside of Caddyfiles can be specified in this Docker Compose as labels as well. So this is a reverse proxy to this upstream on port 80. And it basically supports all of the Caddyfile syntax, but as like this nested dot syntax. You can see a bunch of examples of like how you can specify the tags versus how it gets translated into a Caddy file. And so this makes it super convenient. So you can just set up all your Docker Composes with the correct labels, and then you don't have to manage separate Caddy files. It's all done from your Docker Composes. And like I said, Coolify is actually using this under the hood. When you enable the Caddy proxy, they have this package running behind the scenes, and that's how you can customize things in your Coolify dashboard is you update these labels. So yeah, that's a thing. Can you use emojis in the URL? You can try. The server should be able to respond to them. You just have to handle it. Yeah. Oh, sorry about that, Stony. All right, let's keep going. But yeah, Caddy Docker proxy. Check it out. Hiker Sloth says, great videos. Thank you so much. I have watched both and worked through first on my own VPS. We'll be working through this one as well. I would like to set up some of the other dynamic websites like Next.js and Ruby on Rails. Also would be interesting to see how an email server could be set up. So I'll touch on this quickly because I'm not going to get into like how to set up an email server, but it is possible to self-host your own email server. The issue comes down to IP address reputation because there's so much spam when it comes to email that some of the biggest providers like Gmail and any other like big email providers, they kind of have a big say in what IP addresses are valid or not. And there are lists published that certain email servers can subscribe to that say what bad IP addresses are coming from, or basically IP addresses or IP address ranges that see a lot of spam emails. So when you are attempting to set up your own self-hosted email server, you need to make sure that the IP address that you get is not within these bad subranges and is on a VPS provider that hasn't been specifically marked as like a spam or whatever else. So that's one thing you have to look out for. But if you've done all of that, you make sure you have a good IP address. There's some stuff for it. So there's this thing called Docker Mail Server. It has everything you need: anti-spam, antivirus, SMTP, all of that ready to go in Docker containers. And it includes all of these services that you need. So that's one way. Another one is called MailCow, and it also runs through Docker. So they have all of the possible services that you will need to get it up and going. There's also a thing called Mail in a Box. And then if you want to create like a transactional API email server, Postal is an open source way of doing that. So if you've ever worked with like Mailgun or SendGrid, they let you send emails via an API. Postal is a way of doing that self-hosted. But again, you have to think about IP address reputation. The other thing you have to think about is uptime, right? So you don't want your email server to go down because then you potentially lose emails. Now, there's redundancy built into the like mail system where if email delivery fails, it'll potentially try again. But you might actually lose emails if your VPS hosting your mail server ever goes down. So hosting a mail server should not be done lightly. There's definitely a lot you have to think about, but there's some tools that let you do it fairly easily. Would you trust your own email server? Maybe. Browsers remove the emojis because it's a security risk. Oh, fascinating. Well, there is there's certain top level domain names that actually support emojis in the URL. Would I make a video for self-hosted email? Probably not, just because of it's way harder than you think. Like I did this, like there are certain hosting providers where you can buy like, let's say like business hosting, and they provide an email inbox, and that way you're not managing the mail server, but they give you very similar to these hosting services that give you like a cPanel dashboard. But in this case, I bought one that had a mail inbox provided on it. But for whatever reason, that very popular hosting provider, all of their IP addresses had been marked as potential spam. So no matter what I did, even though I didn't set up the server manually, I was just like using their mail server setup. No matter what I did, all of my messages got marked as spam. It's a whole thing. There's actually like one guy who maintains a spam list, and he like exploits people. There's a whole thing. Like if you get on this list, then you have to like pay him to get your IP address off of the list. I don't know. But ultimately what I did is I used that as my email inbox, because receiving emails is fine. Like servers aren't going to complain if your IP address of a mail that there's of a server they're sending mail to is on a list. They only care if they're receiving mail from that IP address. So what I ended up doing is that's my email inbox manager. So that's where all the mail comes to. And then if I need to send emails, I use AWS simple messaging service to actually send those emails. Yeah. Use Gmail and Cloudflare. Cool. Would you make a video for self-hosted email? But yeah, I don't think I would. All right, let's keep going. Next message comes from Ecognito. It says, good instructional content. I skipped through to see if I could pick up any tips, especially on Caddy, which I've been using for about a year. Gratified that I organized things in Etsy Caddy in a similar fashion. I want to do this very quickly, but one thing I want to show you is another way of managing Caddyfiles. that isn't this idea of creating links in sites available and in sites enabled. And I actually figured this out. Like I researched it when I was making the video, but I didn't end up making any sort of update. But this idea of sites available and sites enabled, it actually comes from the world of Nginx. That's where I learned it, because I have a lot of experience with Nginx. But they, in more recent editions, they actually deprecated it. And they say, well, we don't want to do that anymore. Just put everything in a conf.d folder. And there's a couple of Stack Overflow posts that I'll link here that talk about how some of the things that could go wrong, or that you could do wrong if you're using this sites enabled and sites available way of doing things. So let me show you actually an easier way. So, and just to recap, we have at the root here a Caddy file. That Caddy file says import everything from sites enabled. So if we go into sites enabled and list this here, all of these files are links to sites available. So if I ever want to bring a site down, I actually delete the link in this folder, reload the Caddy service, and then because that file isn't there anymore, that service is going to go down. And this is nice because you don't lose your settings, right? Because if we go into the sites available folder, this has all of the actual files that live here. So if I delete them from sites enabled, I'm just deleting the link. I'm not deleting the actual file. And so that's one way of managing it. But let's talk about another way, and let me show you how to set this up. So what you could do is just have a single folder and call it like a conf.d, so a configuration directory. So let's drop down to a root shell. Okay, I'm in a root shell. I'm going to create a directory called conf.d. I'm going to copy all of the files from sites available into conf.d. So we're just going to do copy sites available /star into confd /star. Like that. Okay. So now if we look in confd, it has all of those same files. Great. But one thing we should do is we're going to put a file extension on all of these files. So that way we'll only look for files with that file extension. So I don't know a way to do this in bulk, but I'm just going to do it manually. So every single file, I'm going to rename it to that file name .caddyfile. So there's probably a way to automate this. It's okay. I like typing. Okay, so at this point, all of my files have the .caddyfile extension. So what I should do is in the main Caddy file, instead of importing from sites available, we're going to import from confd instead. So if we edit that Caddy file, down here at the bottom, instead of importing from sites available, we'll import from confd. And we'll add .caddyfile on the end here. So any file .caddyfile should be imported. Okay. So at this point, really all we've done is we've moved everything from sites available into confd, and now Caddyfile is looking at those. And so if I just do a sudo service reload or service, oh, we're already root. I could just do a service caddy reload. It didn't complain. My sites should still be up. I should still be able to go to not localhost .net. Yeah, that still works. And like Pokemon Cacher still works. Cool. So Caddy is still reverse proxying everything. Everything still works just fine. And I mean, to prove it, let's actually just remove, well, I'm not going to remove them. I'm going to make an old directory, and I'm going to move sites available into that old directory and sites enabled into that old directory. Okay. But this is a lot easier to manage because now you just have a single folder. So anytime you need to create a new website, you put it in this folder. And if you ever want to disable a website, you literally just move the file. So if I want to disable Pokemon Cacher, I'm going to move Pokemon Cacher to PokemonCacher.disabled. And now that it doesn't have the Caddyfile extension, it's not going to be imported into the main config. So I'll do this. That's there. I'll reload Caddy. And now Pokemon Cacher should be down. Yeah, so this site just doesn't exist anymore in the Caddy config. And that's just because I renamed it to disabled. And then if we want to enable the site, we remove the disabled file ending. Like this. And then reload. And now the site works. So honestly, this is a much easier way to manage all of these files because you're not like managing symlinks. And one of the things that Stack Overflow post talks about that I'll link to is like a lot of times some system administrators didn't understand the system and they were creating files in the site's enabled folder when they should have created them over here and it was just a mess. But now if you have a single directory and you just use the file name to disable the files, it's a lot easier to manage. So that's what I would say. You can, ultimately, you can do whatever you want. And when you look at the Caddy documentation, they don't even have a preferred way of doing this, right? It's kind of up to you how you manage all of your Caddy files. But I do like the conf-d way of doing it because it's just less to manage. Yeah. Mamad says, your self-host 101 series really helped me. Oh, that's awesome. Glad to hear it. Yeah, I will do that. Halaku, thank you. Find exec move. Yeah, we could have figured it out. Yeah, the Caddy config is very instant for sure. Awesome. All right, I think I only have a couple questions left. Yeah, in this case, suggestions for next time, and it's really just talking about what I've already mentioned before. So, Belkachik mentions, are you planning to make a video about hosting a Node app in a VPS like Hetzner and Coolify? Would love to see that. And Juana Salome says, I'm very curious to see Coolify in action. Yes, I'm working on it now. It probably won't be out this week, but I'm hoping to publish it next week while I'm away at React Miami. But yeah, the next video is on Coolify, and ultimately I want to make sure that I have enough experience with it. At this point, I've been messing around with it for like about a week, a few days, and I just want to make sure that I figured things out and I can relay all of that to you. But yes, the next video will be on Coolify, where essentially instead of managing your server manually from the command line like this, you can do it all mostly from a web UI. Yeah. And then JitX is mentioning, I have a request. Please, can you create automatic deployments and preview deployments on push to GitHub for full stack apps? That would be just awesome. Yes, and this is something that Coolify supports. So once we get Coolify up and going, they have this idea of preview deployment. So if you've ever used Vercel, they have this where when a pull request gets created, if that user has the right privileges, it'll create a deployment that's specific to that pull request, so that way you can test out the features. And Coolify has support for this. Now, again, you could do it manually. Like we talked about earlier about how to have webhooks. You could write a custom script that like spins up a Caddy file based on the branch name. It's possible to do manually, but Coolify has it built in. So that's pretty slick as well. I will mention, I'll link to this tweet that I made yesterday. I'm still working on the Coolify video, so if there's any specific type of app or stack that you want to see me get up and running, let me know in the comments of this tweet. Because I'm trying to find things like I'm gonna definitely do like a Next.js app and probably get like a Postgres database up and going. Some of the more common things that people do. So I just want to know what you're interested in. Definitely respond in that tweet. Mike the Tree Climber says, so Caddy is like Nginx? Yeah, exactly. In the self-host series, yeah, and this one, probably 15 or so minutes into the video, I talk about how it's similar to Nginx and Traffic and Apache HTTPD. Yeah, Caddy is basically a web server, but very easy to configure and very, very minimal to configure. Do Laravel, I also don't need a build step. Yeah, people have been mentioning Laravel. Ultimately, if I can't find like an open source Laravel, I mean, actually Coolify, Coolify is built with Laravel. It'd be very interesting to deploy a Coolify instance with Coolify, but I might get like the, just a plain old Laravel app up and going, like generate one and then show how to deploy that. But yeah, that is coming up next. Okay. Adam Collier who we saw in the chat earlier, is asking about build server. So a great video, yet again, CJ. I've recently been playing with Coolify on Hetzner to host my own database and analytics. I did try deploying my personal site, but I have some image resizing, etc. as part of the build process, and it's pretty CPU intensive and caused other issues in other servers to go down. So this is very similar to how earlier when we were running the Docker Compose up, it had to build the images and we went up to like 70% CPU usage. Anytime you're running a build on your server, you would potentially have to worry about that. So would love to know how to handle situations like this and tips on caching. Great video. Yeah. And then Jake Hill says, now we need a video on Docker plus Caddy setting up a remote build server. So that's what I'm going to point you to, because Coolify actually has this idea of a build server built in. So once you get Coolify up and going, you can configure a separate server, install Coolify on it, and designate that server as the build server. And so anytime Coolify needs to perform a build task, it's going to do it remotely on that other server and then copy all of the build artifacts back to the main Coolify server. And that's basically how you manage this, is you just need a separate service that is doing your builds instead of the main VPS itself. I talked about earlier, like GitHub Actions. That's another way to do it. Essentially, instead of spinning up your own build server, you're using GitHub Actions as your build server. So that's a possibility as well. But it is nice that Coolify currently has experimental support for build servers. All right, that's all I have. I'll catch up on the chat and then we'll just do a quick plug for Sentry. What is Coolify exactly? Think of it as like a self-hosted Heroku or a self-hosted Vercel. Basically, you can run it on your own server and get a very easy, like one-click deploy-like experience. Instead of a build server, you could use your local machine. That's another way to do it. So Coolify has this idea of like local host and remote servers. So like, yeah, technically you could have it running all the time on your home machine. It could detect changes, probably through like a Cloudflare tunnel or something like that, run the build and then push it to like a remote Coolify instance. That's definitely possible. Yeah. Cool. And thank you, FD. Thank you for the heart. All right. Yeah, let's do a plug for Sentry. So Syntax is brought to you by Sentry. If you're not familiar with it, visit sentry.io. They are an application monitoring softwares. So you can add it into your backend codes, into your front-end codes, and then anytime an error happens in production, you can be alerted of it, and it does a nice grouping of errors, so you can see how often that error is occurring, and you can see stack traces, like full stack traces. So if you have Sentry installed in both your front-end and your backend, you can very easily see like when an error occurred and kind of like follow it from the front end to the back end. And they show you how many users are coming across that error. So it's just really good to have some insight into your app that's running in production. They have a bunch of other features too. So they also have a performance monitoring feature. So you don't even have to do anything special for this. Like, let's say you want to see the performance of your database queries. Sentry will automatically detect slow queries. So it'll show you in your dashboard all of the database queries that are happening, how long they take, and then you can very quickly see, oh, this query is using or is taking 4 or 5 times longer than my normal queries. And they also can detect like N+1 queries and stuff like that. So once your app is running in production and users are using your app, you can get a much better idea of which parts of the app are getting hit and which parts you need to do performance tuning on. There's also a session replay. You can see exactly what a user was doing when an error occurred. You can also get alerts when error occurred. Sentry is awesome. One thing I'll point you to is self-hosted Sentry. So you can use the hosted Sentry option. They also have a very generous free tier. But if you want to self-host it, you can, since we're talking about self-hosting on your own server. So they have a whole set of documentation on how to get it running on your own system. They talk about minimum requirements as well. But you can self-host it on your own server. You could have your status page on your own server. You could have all of your databases and apps running on your own server along with Sentry, and get alerted when stuff is happening there as well. So definitely check out Sentry.io and check out self-hosted if you're interested in getting that up and going. So yeah. Could you, Phil is saying, could you explain the difference between infrastructure as a code tools like Terraform and Pulumi versus configuration tools like Ansible and machine images like AMI? I don't have much experience at all with these. What I would probably say the biggest difference is infrastructure as code potentially has the ability to automatically provision new resources. Like it could actually spin up its own, a new VPS purely from configuration. Because like it has integrations and plugins with like the AWS API and like the Google Cloud API and stuff like that. So you can have a Terraform configuration that literally spins up these instances. Whereas, as far as I could be wrong here, but I do think Ansible is more so about, okay, once you have an instance up and going, here's a set of configuration to run on that machine. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's a good place to start. Is this stream sponsored by Coolify? No, it's not. No, it's not. Yeah. And Green Thumb says, I love what you've been doing with Syntax. Thank you, Green Thumbs. And SRG says, I miss your avatar minigames in chat. Well, eventually, once we get more live streams here on the Syntax channel, we'll figure out minigames and stuff like that. All right. I think that's all I have for you. This was my first live stream on Syntax. I had a good time. I really do appreciate everyone for hanging out and asking your questions. They were great. And please keep asking your questions. So without you, it would just be me. It would just be me making videos. So I appreciate the comments that you make. I appreciate the questions that you have, and keep them coming. So on any of the existing videos as well, I'll go ahead and link to this series, because this is what we've specifically been talking about today. On any of those videos, if you have questions, I'm checking the comments often and answering anything that might come up. And we've got at least one more video on Coolify coming up in the series as well. So SRG says you're a beast of live stream. Oh, thank you, SRG. All right, that's all I got for you. We're going to get out of here. This was fun. Hopefully we can do it again soon. And again, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you for your questions. You're great. You're awesome. Stay awesome.